We're on Daf Chaf, and we're up to the second line, Ahu Gavra, the Amr Lahu. So let's just review the last point as a good takeoff, and that is that we had a suffix of Rab Shimon ben Lakish about a person who made the following neder. He took upon himself Harei Alai Toda, and then he added a Tnai. The Eitze Ba Yidei Chovas Shalmei Chagiga. So he wanted to kill two birds with one stone, to fulfill two obligations of two separate karbanos with one zevach. On the one hand, it should be a carbon toda, and that was his neder. On the other hand, he has a chiyuv to bring a carbon chagiga. And Rabbi Yochanan responded to Reish Lakish that in this case, and we have a similar case also in Nazir with Meiser Shady money, the chiyuv, the neder, is chal, and the t'nai is not chal. That means he's obligated to bring this carbon toda, but he cannot use it as a carbon chagiga. He'll have a separate independent chiyuv to bring a carbon chagiga. So the Gemara tells us a story, again, about someone who makes a commitment and then adds a t'nai as a tag on to his commitment. The Amar Lei, now this is what we call tzavas shchivmira. So a person is on his deathbed and he says, Havu lei arba me'azuzi leplodi. I want you to give from the estate 400 zuz, which is a significant sum, to so-and-so. V'linsov brati, and he will marry my daughter. As if to say that the money I'm giving him is on the condition that he marries my daughter. Amar Papa, arba mi'ah shakil, that person will collect 400 zuz, as was promised him in the pledge of the Shchimira. Ubrate, but as far as marrying the fellow's daughter, Iboy Nasiv, if he decides to marry her, he'll marry her. Iboy Lo Nasiv, if he decides not to marry her, he won't marry her. And once again, the logic is the same as that of Rabbi Yochanan earlier on this daf, that if you commit yourself with a neder and then you add a t'nai as a tag on to the neder, then the neder is chal, irrelevant to the t'nai, independent of the t'nai. However, what happens, asks the Gemara, if he would switch it around? Had he started with the t'nai and then made the commitment? The reason why he cannot obligate the recipient to marry his daughter is that's because the Omar, first he said, Havule, give him a 400 zuz, and then I would add the words acharkach, after he said, linsiv biti, let him marry my daughter. Avol, but what if he did it the other way around? Omar linsiv, marry my daughter, and then v'havule, give him 400 zuz. In that case, the t'nai is valid and binding, and the recipient will have no rights to collect the 400 zuz unless he marries the fellow's daughter. He nasiv shakil, he can receive the money if he marries her. Lo nasiv, if he doesn't marry her, lo shakil, he will not collect the mos. Yosiv Meremar, v'ka Omar lahosh maitita. Meremar was teaching this sugya that we learned earlier, when a person, as Rabbi Yochanan had it, said Harei Alai Toda, and then he adds the t'nai of the Eitze Ba Yidei Chagiga, or in the case of Nazir, already Nazir, and then I'll use the mos of my Sasheni to buy the karbanos at the termination of my Naziris. He said it Mishmei Denafshe. In other words, Meremar thought it was his original ruling. You should know that Atun Hachi Masnisale, you present and transmit this shmua, this sugya, as if it were your own original ruling. But Anan, we learned the same ruling from a discussion between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Now we begin a sugya that has really two parts to it, two sides to it. On the one hand, we have to deal with the issue of smicha bekarbanos. That's going to be one part of this sugya. And we're going to have to determine which karbanos require smicha, which do not. And the other side of this sugya is about what's called a karban olas re'iyah, and whether we bring that on yontif or not. So to present the background of this sugya, we open up Sefer Vayikra to the first and third chapters. And what do we find in these two chapters? We find the mitzvah of smicha, first in chapter 1, and the Torah says, im olah karbano. So we're talking about what's called an olas nidava, a voluntary karban olah. A person took a pledge, a neder or a nidava, to bring a karban olah, and the Torah says, v'samach yado al rosha olah, and he's obligated the mitzvah of smicha. Now we fast forward to Perek Gimel of Sefer Vayikra, and there in the parsha of Shlomim, the Torah says, v'im zevach shlomim karbano, and once again, v'samach yado al rosh karbano. And here the word karban is referring to a karban olas, a karban nidavas shlomim. So we have two nidavos here. The first is an olah, the second nidava is a shlomim, and in both cases, the Torah says that he has to do smicha. Now, how do we know that these two parshios are referring specifically to a karban nidava? Because the Torah opens up these two parshios with the words Adam ki yakriv mikem karban. And the mashmos is that when a man wants to bring a karban and he volunteers to, through a pledge, to bring a karban, then whether it's a karban olah, an olas nidava, or it is an olas, a nidavas shlamim shalmei nidava, in both cases, he has to do smicha. Tani Tana Kamed Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. So one of the Chachamim presented a Beitza to Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. Now, in this Beitza, we're going to look at a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Tes, and the subject of that Beitza is Parsha Shmini, is Shmini L'Miluim. And there were certain obligatory karbanos that Aaron Ubanav had to bring at the end of the process, which was a week long, of establishing what's called the Chanukas HaMishkan. And then on the 8th day, which is called the Shmini L'Miluim, the Torah commands Aaron to bring a karban olah. Now that olah is called an olas chova. Until now, we've been discussing an olas nidava, and the Torah says explicitly that he's required smicha. What about an olas chova? Like in the case of the olah that God commanded Aaron to bring on the 8th day of Miluim, vayakrev es ha'olah vayaseha kim mishpat. And the Beitza of Rabbi Yitzchak is now going to learn from the extra word kim mishpat that there's a chiyuv of smicha in the case of an olas chova. And in that same perek, the 9th chapter of Leviticus, I think it's called, of Vayikra, it says, Kach lecha egel ben bakar lechatos v'ayel la'olah. So now we're focused on the ayel li'olah, and nowhere in the Torah does the Torah tell us that a karban olas chova requires smicha. We don't know that. We have to do detective work to figure that out. And that's going to be derived from the word kimishpat. Kimishpat olas nidava, which we saw at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, and there the Torah says explicitly, v'samach yado rosh ha'olah, is limed al olas chova shehi te'una smicha, that just like an olas nidava, where the Torah says explicitly you require smicha, so to an olas chova, kim mishpat has the same law and the same obligation as an olas nidava, and it requires smicha. Now, the implication of this brisa is that if not for the extra word mishpat, if we were only operating with human logic, then we would not be able to derive the conclusion that olas chova requires smicha, which means that we would have limited olas, we would have limited smicha to olas nidava without applying it to an olas chova. And that seems counterintuitive. If in an olas nidava, which the Torah didn't even obligate you to bring, and yet you're chayiv in smicha, how much more so in an olas chova, that should be even a greater chiyuv than an olas nidava, which requires smicha. So Rabbi Yitzchak, trying to make sense out of this brisa and the necessity of deriving olas chova from a special yalfusa, the extra word mishpat, the Amar Lecha Mani. If anybody asks you the question, to which Tana should you attribute this brisa, tell him Beis Shammai. It reflects the Shita Beit Shammai. And Beit Shammai in our Mishnah was of the opinion that we would bring a carbon shlamim, then we do not do smicha. And again, we're probably talking about a problem of yontiv, because in the case of smicha in Beit Shammai's perspective, you could have done the smicha on erev yontiv. The lo gemire shalmei chova mishalmei nedava. The Gemara now seems to assume that in Shalmei Chova, according to Beit Shammai, there is no smicha at all, not just on Yontif, because, as I said before, he could have done the smicha on Erev Yontif. But period. Shalmei Chova, we have to figure out what cases are Shalmei Chova. Let's say certain korbanos, maybe of a Nazir, and so many korbanos Chova of Shlamim, they, according to Beit Shammai, did not require smicha, which means that even though the Torah tells me explicitly in the third parak of Vayikra, that Shalmei Nedava requires smicha, we don't derive Shalmei Chova from Shalmei Nedava, which again, as we said before, is counterintuitive. The Lo Gamri, Shalmei Chova Mishalmei Nedava. And this is based on what we call a pircha. Whenever you have an objection or a counter to a logical derivation, that's called a pircha. And the pircha here is that Shalmei Nidava are frequent. That's called matzui. Because at any moment in time, during the course of 365 days in a year, you can take upon yourself a neder or a nidava to bring a carbon shlamim. That's called matzui. It's commonplace. Ma'asim b'chol yom, that we bring Shalmei Nedava. Shalmei Chova are very rare and far between. So maybe in the common matzui carbon, like Shalmei Nedava, the Torah requires smicha, and that's explicit in the Torah Vayikra Gimel. But we cannot derive any conclusions about a more rare kind of carbon, which is Shalmei Chova. That's the logic of Beit Shammai. And if we apply that logic, like a mirror image, you have shlamim on one side and ol on the other, and Beit Shammai is going to apply that logic and say that we cannot derive olas chova, like the case of the ol of Aaron on the 8th day of Miluim, from olas nidava, because olas nidava is again commonplace. It's matzui. Any day of the year, a person can take upon himself a pledge to bring a carbon olah voluntarily. Whereas olas chova is more rare and far between. And therefore, according to Beit Shammai, we need a special pasuk to derive and prove that an olas chova needs smicha. But to Beis Hillel, but if I go with Beis Hillel, who's of the opinion that even Shalmei Chova requires smicha, is Kevan de Gamre Shalmei Chova Mishalmi Netova. Beis Hillel never accepted this pircha from Matsui to Eno Matsui, and therefore he derives Shalmei Nidava, Shalmei Chova from Shalmei Nidava, that just like Shalmei Nidava, the Torah explicitly requires smicha, so too Shalmei Chova requires smicha, is therefore we're going to apply the same logic to Karban Ola. And Olas Chova, Nami Loti Boy Kra, the Gamri Meolas Chova, Meolas Nidava. Since the Torah says explicitly at the beginning of Vayikra that an Olas Nidava requires smicha, Beis Hillel will derive an Olas Chova from Olas Nidava, and he doesn't accept the pircha of Matsui versus Eno Matsui. And why then would this brisa require a pasuk mishpat in order to establish that an Olas Chova requires smicha? We would know it logically. So the Gemara rejects this entire presentation. You're assuming that the reason why Rabbi Beis Hillel in our Mishnah requires smicha in Shalmei Chova is because they derive Shalmei Chova from Shalmei Nidava. Maybe Beis Hillel also has the same pircha as Beit Shammai. They cannot derive Shalmei Nidava, Shalmei Chova from Shalmei Nidava. They have a different source from whence they derive that Shalmei Nidava, Shalmei Chova, requires smicha. Dilma me olas chova kabiri. They make an equation that goes across the political lines from Ola to Shlamim, and they say that the commonality is chova. And once we derive from Kimishpat that olas chova require smicha, now we're going to jump and derive the conclusion that Shalmei Chova likewise requires smicha. Olas Chova Gufa Baikra. Once we establish that Olas Chova, based on the limud, the drasha of Kimishpat, requires smicha, now we'll derive the conclusion that Shalmei Chova likewise requires smicha. So the Gemara is not happy with the dechia, and the Gemara says, Maishna Mishalmei Nidava Delo Gemiri. If Beis Hillel agree to and accept the pircha of Beit Shammai, and therefore you cannot derive Shalmei Chova for smicha from Shalmei Nidava, shekain Mitzuyim, because Shalmei Nidava are Mitzuyim, meaning at any point during the entire year you could be chayav to bring through your neder a Shalmei Nidava, is then me olas chova nami lo gemiri. How could they possibly derive Shalmei Chova from olas chova? Because here too we have a pircha. And what's the pircha? The pircha is shekain kolil. You cannot derive shlamim from ola for a simple reason. Ola is more chamur. On the totem pole, the hierarchy of karbanos, ola is on the top. It's the top banana at the spitz of the pyramid because it's kulo kolil. It's totally burnt on the mizbeach. The Torah gives the gavah, gives Hashem the entire carbon. So if the Torah requires smicha in the case of olas chova, which is derived now from Kimishpat, doesn't prove a thing about Shalmei Chova, because shlamim are eaten by the Kohen and Eilim, and it's not on the same level as a korban olah. So therefore, the Gemara says now that this brisa could reflect even the shita of Beis Hillel, and Beis Hillel will concede to Beit Shammai that we cannot derive a korban chova from a binyan av, meaning from a logical analogy to a korban nedava, because nedava is matzui and chova is not matzui. And from that same logical reason of pircha, we cannot derive smicha in a korban shlamim, meaning Shalmei Chova from olas chova, because olas chova is kulei kolil. is the Gemara says, but Asya mi beinei. Now, Asya mi beinei is an Aramaic phrase which is equal to what's called a bamematzinu, meaning if we want to derive C, we cannot derive C from A because of a certain pircha. We cannot derive C from B because of another different pircha. But if we join forces between A and B, that's called a bamematzinu, then we could derive C. And the Gemara now wants to establish a chiyuv smicha according to Beis Hillel in the case of shalmei chova from a binyan av with a bamematzinu. And we'll go through the logic of the bamematzinu as follows. If you're going to derive Shalmei Chova. Again, the koteret here, the subject is Shalmei Chova. Is there smicha in Shalmei Chova? So if we're going to derive it from Shalmei Nedava, we'll reject that based on the pircha of Matzu. So then we're going to introduce Olas Chova. Olas Chova is not Matzu, and yet the Torah still requires smicha, and that we derive from Kimishpat. You can't derive from Olas Chova to Shalmei Chova because Ola is Kula Kolil. But then we're going to introduce, once again, Shalmei Nedava, which is not Kolil. So therefore, we'll join together these two forces, Shalmei Nedava and Olas Chova, and both are a carbon that a yachid, an individual, has to bring. They both require nisachim, and they're both obligated in smicha. So therefore, we're going to derive from them that any carbon that's similar to these two carbonos, in that it's a carbon yachid, it requires nisachim, and therefore it requires smicha, and that's how Beis Hillel are going to derive Shalmei Chova, meaning smicha in Shalmei Chova. So now the Gemara says let's just summarize where we're holding at this point in the sugya, that from Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, we derive that according to Beit Shammai, Shalmei Chova do not require smicha at all. So Gemara says, "V'savri Beit Shammai sheshalmei Chova lo boy smicha." Your assumption, Rabbi Yitzchak, your premise is that Beit Shammai don't require in Shalmei Chova smicha at all. For Asanya, we have a Beitza, and this Beitza quotes Rabbi Yossi, who will now put the machlokes shin Beit Shammai Beis Hillel into a framework. On Rabbi Yossi lo nechlaku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel al smicha atzma. In other words, in the case of Shalmei Chova, both Beis Hillel and even Beit Shammai agree that you require smicha. Shetzarech, you need smicha. So what is the machlokes? Aman nechlaku al tekef l'smicha shchita. Can I do the smicha on Erev Yontif and then shech the carbon 24 hours later on the morning of Yontif? Beit Shammai omrim eino tzarech. The Torah doesn't require that immediately after the smicha you do the shchita, which, by the way, I'm not sure if that's halach in smicha or it's halach in shchita, but in any event, Beit Shammai waived that requirement, and therefore let him do the smicha on shlamim on Erev Yontif. No loss. And we're not going to allow you to do smicha, which is a shvus, on Yontif itself. Beis Hillel omrim tzarech, that you need to have the shchita immediately after the smicha, and therefore you don't have an option of doing the smicha on Erev Yontif for the shchita, almost a day later on Yontif. So if this be the case, we have a question on Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, who said that according to Beit Shammai, Shalmei Chova don't require smicha at all. So the Gemara says, "Who the Omaki Haitana?" That Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba was standing on the shoulders of a different Tana. This Sanya we learned in the Beitza, Omer Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Nechlaku Beit Shammai, U Beis Hillel. I'll take if smicha shchita shetzarech. Even Beit Shammai, according to this version, require, again, let's not confuse, this is not the same Rabbi Yossi that we had in the first price. This is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Anyway, according to his version, even Beit Shammai require a smichus between shchita and smicha, meaning that the shchita has to take place immediately after the smicha. But b'men echleku al smicha atzma. And this is a reflection of what we saw in Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, that Beit Shammai omer meino tzarech. There's no requirement to smicha whatsoever on Shalmei Chova. Ubeis Hillel omrim tzarech. And therefore, if you need smicha on Shalmei Chova, then the smicha will have to take place on Yontif, because you don't have the option of smicha on Erev Yontif because of the halacha of samach l'shchita smicha. Therefore, to summarize, Rabbi Yitzchak holds like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Tan Rabbanon, Ma'aseh b'Hillel HaZaken. Now, Hillel HaZaken dates back to the time between the original Shammai and the original Hillel and the Talmidim, what we call Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Evi Olasa. Now, if you recall from yesterday's discussion on Daf Yutes, there's machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai regarding Olas Re'iyah, whereas Beit Shammai say postpone the Olas Re'iyah till Chol HaMoed. Beis Hillel classify Olas Re'iyah as a chiyuv of the Yom, of the regel, and therefore you will bring this Olas Re'iyah on Yontif itself. And now Hillel HaZaken is bringing his Olas Re'iyah to the Azara on Yontif itself. And Lismach Aleh b'Yontif, he's going to do smicha on the carbon. He's about to do smicha, and then they stop him, dead in his tracks. Chavru olav Talmidim Shammai HaZaken. The Talmidim of Shammai circled him because they suspected he was bringing the Olas Re'iyah. And they wanted to object and prevent him from violating the ruling of their Rebbe Shammai, and they wanted to make a protest. Amru lo, they said to Mativa Shalbei Mizu. What is this? Is this a carbon ola? Is this an Olas Re'iyah? Now, Hill understood what was going on over here. He recognized the Talmidim of Shammai HaZaken, and he understood that they were coming to challenge him and undermine him. But Hillel HaZaken was famous for what's called anvenus, which means humility, and he tried to avoid contention. He was the Ish HaShalom, the man of peace. Amalahem Nikevahi. He lied to them. And he told them that this animal is a female animal. A female animal could never be brought as an olah. So he was basically hinting to them that, you're right. I would not bring an olas re'iyah on Yontif, as if to say that he consented and accepted the view of Beit Shammai, of Shammai. And I'm bringing it for what's called Shalmei Chova. And Shalmei Chova, even according to Beit Shammai, are brought on Yontif, because the Torah requires us to bring a carbon shlomim on Yontif. And Hill tries to sort of demonstrate to them that this is a female animal. Kishkesh lahem biznava. He starts taking the tail, because, if you lift up the tail of the animal, you could see whether it's male or female. And they didn't even check him out to see whether he's telling the truth or not. Since he was he demonstrated it so publicly, then holchu lahem, they let him go. They accepted the lie that he was really bringing not an olas re'iyah, but Shalmei Simcha, Shalmei Chov of Yod. Now, once the Talmidim saw that Hillel himself backtracked and accepted the sheet of Shammai, Osayom Gavra Yodam Shel Beit Shammai Beis Hillel. Now they had a proof, the Chabura of Talmidim Beit Shammai had a proof that, we accept the halacha like Beit Shammai. Ubikshu l'kfo halacha kamosa. They wanted to establish a public ruling that we don't bring an olas re'iyah on Yontif. We wait till Chol HaMoed. V'hoyesham zoken echad mitalmidei Shammai zoken uben bava ben buta shmo. And I think in the Gemara Nedarim, there's a whole story about this Bava ben Buta. He knew that the halacha was like Beis Hillel, and we do bring an olas re'iyah on Yontif, and Hillel was just out of a sense of loving peace. He told him a fib. I mean, there's a whole discussion here in the Mefarshim about Shanin Mipnei Shalom, that for peace you're allowed to tell a fib and fabricate the truth.